you everybody for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mike Everson. Mike Everson is Emeritus Associate Professor of Foreign Language Education at the University of Iowa and an independent consultant for a number of national Chinese language learning initiatives. Having spent 10 years teaching Chinese at the United States Air Force Academy before his 18-year tenure at Iowa, his research interests include how American students learn to read in Chinese, as well as issues surrounding Chinese language learning in the United States. His scholarship has appeared in a variety of journals and book collections, with his most recently co-edited publications being Teaching Chinese as a Foreign Language, Theories and Applications with Xiaoyun, and Research Among Learners of Chinese as a Foreign Language with Helen Shen. He was also one of the lead designers of Read Chinese, an online reading project designed for high school learners of Chinese through the National Foreign Language Center in College Park, Maryland, and it has mostly recently been involved with Chinese language development projects with the College Board, Asia Society, and the Chinese Early Language Immersion Network. He served 2 terms on the board of directors of the Chinese Language Teachers Association and was on the executive board of the National Council of Less Commonly Taught Languages, where he served as its president. So let's invite a little bit into the panel is the importance of reading in the world language curriculum. If, after the talk, if you have questions, you're going to have this to ask.
Thank you very much, Xin. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and I want to thank Cang Lao Shi and Liang Lao Shi for inviting me to this most prestigious university and to interact with all of you. As far as my background goes, what I want us to do, since we have a small group here, which I like because all of you come from very, very different language backgrounds and language groups, but I notice that many of you are from what we call less commonly taught languages, which is something that as Liang Lao Shi said, I was president of the National Council of Less Commonly Taught Languages, and it gave me a great appreciation of what you all do. And I really believe that this is a time where we are seeing a lot more traction in terms of less commonly taught language instruction in America. Now, don't get me wrong, the more commonly taught languages, especially Spanish, are going to be very large. When Spanish teachers would come up to me at ACTFL and say, gosh, I'm seeing all these Chinese people around here, I tell them, don't quit your day job. The reason is that there's always going to be a need for Spanish for a number of reasons. And it remains our largest language that's taught in the world language. But having said that, it is interesting to see growth in languages like Chinese, stability in languages like Japanese, and up-and-coming languages that are coming on board, especially in terms of different levels. Now, one of the things that's a little bit difficult for me when I was talking to Fun about coming here and speaking is sometimes I'm not exactly sure what my audience is going to be, and that's always a tough sell, because if you ever take public speaking, the number one thing you have to do is know your audience. So what I've decided to do is we're going to look at, with my talk today, some of the things that in my career I have found to be very, very influential, and also some of the things that are going on within the United States in education that are going to be very, very important in terms of curricular design. I wasn't sure how many teachers I was going to have here today. I wasn't sure how many researchers I was going to have here today. So I'm going to have a little bit of everything for all of you. Because the important thing is that I'm going to have some of my prejudices come through as well. And one of my prejudices, I guess, maybe that's the wrong word, but just the idea that I think we tend to favor in world language instruction the spoken language. And I'm not going to say that that's a bad idea, because we know from research that that's what students want to learn how to do. So that's very important. But as we know, this is very, very time consuming. And oftentimes reading is shoved to the background. Oftentimes reading is thought to develop by itself. And oftentimes reading is thought, well, my students know how to read in their first language, so they'll easily pick up reading in the second language. Now, there's debate on how much of that is true, but I can guarantee you one thing. Once we start to talk about reading Chinese, everything gets really, really complicated. It gets complicated for our students, it gets complicated for our teachers, it gets complicated for our curriculum design, our classroom activities, and it gets complicated for our assessment. So all the way down the line, this idea of reading is very difficult. Now, the other thing is, we have other members of communities of Japanese, of Arabic, of Farsi, who are also probably dealing with some of these issues as well. Some things that are closer to our alphabet, maybe like the Cyrillic alphabet, may be a little bit easier because it uses the alphabetic principle, but it's still going to be a challenge for our students. So what I wanted to talk about are some of these issues that I think are important for all of us to look at in terms of curricular design, because as I mentioned to you earlier, if we tend to have a lot of work with the spoken language, my worry is that we don't have a principled reading pedagogy in place. In other words, well, we'll have them maybe do this, do that, and a lot of times what I worry about, and I'll use the example of Chinese, as we're going to see in my talk today, much of the research and much of what our students end up doing is learning characters. Now, clearly, that's not a bad idea, but oftentimes teachers will think, this is the main focus. I can go to a conference and say, my students learned 150 characters during a semester, but you have to ask yourself, what does that really tell you? Because lots of times we don't know what they can do with those characters or what they are doing with those characters because there's no pedagogy in place. Again, I'm not being critical of our profession as much as I'm saying that this is really, really hard and that we have to get an idea about this. Because if we don't, our expectations of what our students are going to be able to do will probably not be there. Oftentimes in terms of reading, what I think we do is we teach bits of reading. In other words, the students are taught different things about vocabulary and different things about reading, but one of the things that they don't actually do is go out and read. And there's a lot of reasons why they don't do that. And we're going to talk about those, and I want to get some input from those of you who teach as well, because I think that that's a very, very important thing. I always love this quote that I use, and I can't remember. I learned it from this big book once, and I forgot who quoted it. And I went, and it was about a 500-page book, and I couldn't find the quote. But it was a quote that stuck with me, because it said, reading researchers agree on very little, but what they do agree on is that you get better at reading by reading. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of practicing and doing these types of activities, because if the students are not actually doing reading, why would you expect them to improve? So these are a couple of the topics that I'm going to do. One of the things that I think is exciting about this time, for those of you who are Chinese teachers, I always say that this is a golden age of Chinese language learning. And I say that, and the reason I like to use that is because Chinese people love to talk about different ages. You've got the Han Dai, Tang Dai, all of these different epochs that are eras that are so famous for different things. But I always say that when the history of Chinese language learning is written 200 years from now, they will look back and say, this was a golden age. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. And some of this gets into this idea that we are at a time when standards-based instruction is becoming very, very important. Really, it's the age of standards. If you look at what the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages talked about from around the 1990s forward, it was about this idea of coming to terms with standards. And we see that the Common Core state standards in first language arts are putting forward kind of a national curriculum. And I understand that not all states are buying into this, and I understand that Virginia is one. But I will tell you one thing, that doesn't mean that people are not into standards-based instruction, because they are. As far as Chinese goes, I remember a very, very interesting study that came out from the National Foreign Language Center in 1992. And it looked at high school Chinese, which was a relatively new thing among some schools. And it's a very interesting report. If any of you want the citation, what I'd like you to do is email me, and I'd be happy to send you these resources that I quote, because it talked about the total lack of standardization in Chinese language learning. I mean, teaching Jiantizi, Fantizi, whether we write characters, whether we read characters, the teachers, who are they? There was no standardization. And I think that our profession was able to act as kind of an experiment of this is where the baseline is and we have to get better. And so consequently there has been a lot of work done through the Chinese Language Teachers Association, the class organization on trying to work out this idea about standardization and what the profession really, really needs. But clearly when you look at, now this is a first language curriculum that they're talking about, the demands are very, very high. This is about American children learning English. And we're seeing that we're moving more towards a competency-based evidence type of system to evaluate student performance and proficiency rather than just seat time. For those of you who might not know that term, seat time is just occupying the chair. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, it's a very, very common metric. First-year Chinese, I sort of have in my mind what a first-year Chinese student looks like after a semester. But oftentimes it's very variable, and until you really know and gotten into the curriculum and looked at the assessments, you're probably not going to know that. And we reject that. We reject that, the idea of seat time. We want to do better than that. We want to be able to have evidence and scales that give us a better handle on proficiency. One of the things that we want to do is also use these standards to give us a guideline of where we need to move, what we need to do to move people along the language proficiency guideline or a timeline, and also to be able to come up with this idea of increasing their proficiency not only in the spoken but also in reading. The other things that you're going to see if you look at standards-based instruction, and this is very, very important, always asking what your students can do. Now this moves away from the question of how many characters do your students know? You're asking, what can they do with the 150 characters that they have? This is a very, very different way of looking at it. This is a very, very different way of moving towards things that you can see and things that you can measure. And you know something? Students like this better too. I mean, the standard joke when I was a foreign language student was, gosh, I studied 3 years of French or German or Spanish or Chinese and I didn't know how to ask where the bathroom was. Okay? If you're asking them where they can do, maybe one of the objectives is take care of personal needs. Because obviously all of us have bathroom stories in the foreign language. Okay? The other thing that we're getting into with standards-based instruction that is critically important is the idea of how a language course will look, because it's getting into content information and cultural information. These are really, really important things. As we move, remember I talked about this golden age, we're starting to see programs in bilingual education in Chinese, where students are actually learning content at a young age. This is a very, very different kind of kettle of fish that you have to do. The other things that we're doing is getting into the idea of content areas, what students are able to do, not only with oral text, but written text about engaging content. I think as far as myself, I remember what language courses sort of looked like. Okay? Lots of grammar, lots of language analysis, lots of not talking in the target language. And this is changing because of that. One of the things that we really have to get a handle on is this idea of looking at texts, complex texts that contain academic language, that get high school kids into what they will study at the post-secondary level. And for those of you who are interested in advanced level classes, preparing students, let's say, to go to a foreign university and study. To take a study abroad program in a university where they're expected to do the same assignments as the native Chinese students. Just the thought of that absolutely terrifies me. The idea of doing that. But yet, this is something that, given what we know about standards, and given what we know about content areas, and given what we know about assessment, we can do this, although it will be very, very complicated. The other thing that we're getting to that's very, very important, that if you look at American education that has been very heavily criticized, is that we have to make critical thinkers out of our children. And so when we get into this idea about taking text, taking reading text, spoken text, and finding the evidence and evaluating the evidence for certain arguments. So this is very, very complicated. This is very, very complicated. Now this is the first language curriculum that's important. This one I like because it's important that if any of you are literature people or literature professors, you are not our enemy. We want to be able to take our students to the level to where they can read literary texts. It's very, very important because we know that the knowledge that they get out of authentic materials, the cultural knowledge, the cultural perspectives are just really, really important. Now, fortunately, there are materials from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Language, or ACTFL, that are trying to align this standards issue. And consequently, recently was published an update of what you might know as the 5 C's, the standards of foreign language, that are now called the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning. I like that title. You know why? Because we think it's our mission to make our students ready for the world in the 21st century. And we believe that we as language educators have a very, very important part to play. So that's kind of the background on where we are. And the other reason I wanted to bring this up is because to the extent that students in bilingual programs, students in FLES programs, foreign language in the elementary school, students in high school programs, have standardized curriculum, to the extent that they have that, you as university professors and teachers are going to find that you have a very different person to work with. They are going to be educated very differently. They are going to be doing things very differently. And what universities, in my humble opinion, have to do is make a place for them. Because they will have skills that need to be further developed. Many of them will come out of programs such as the Advanced Placement Program that are going to be very, very different from students who maybe just had what we would consider more traditional programs. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to shift gears and ask you, well, what are some of the things with reading that can help us out? And I always like to look at Elizabeth Bernhardt's model. She's a reading researcher at Stanford University. And she basically has collected a lot of data on how people read second languages. And it's actually kind of interesting because our research base in foreign language reading is very derivative from first language. A lot of the models are similar. We also take things from the ESL world. We take things from the Chinese as a first language world. And where we need to get more research is from the learners who are actually learning that language. And Bernhardt has done a lot of work in having students read texts and then writing down what they remember. In other words, what is the narrative? And for those of you who are into research, it's called a recall protocol. And the recall protocol is scored into the different units that the students have shown that they have remembered from the text. And what Elizabeth Bernhardt has found is that the errors, about 50% of the variance are in these categories. Word recognition, where they misinterpret a word in the context that it appears. Okay. I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. When I was first studying this model, I liked it because oftentimes we don't get down to the word level. Lots of times if you're studying Spanish or you're studying French or German, word recognition, I'm not saying that it's not complicated, but it's a little bit easier because it uses an alphabetic principle. And also I can look at a German text and say, these are words. Whereas in Chinese we can't do that oftentimes. And we'll get to that in a minute. So we have word recognition. Also the idea that students made mistakes in similarities in sounds and similarities in visual similarities that they found in text. In other words, they made mistakes when they saw words that seemed to have the same sound or looked like other words. Okay? She called this phonemic and graphemic decoding. It's probably not surprising to you that she found students also made grammar errors and syntax. So in other words, the relationships between the words were different. And she also found, interestingly enough, that students had difficulties with what she called intratextual perception. In other words, the idea of if they learned something in the first paragraph, how did it seem to work to the second? This gets into the whole notion of text structure, which is important in first language as well. She also found, because it was a written protocol, that the students reflected on their own comprehension. When they wrote out the protocol, they would have, I think that this means, or I think that he went there and found this, or the text goes on, but I'm clueless as what the meaning is. The students would actually write those in the protocols. So if you ever do recall protocol research, it's actually very interesting. So the idea of metacognition, this idea of evaluating, this is a 25-cent word for what you know about your own knowing. Okay? Very, very powerful, very, very important concept. And to the extent that you can use research protocols where students talk about what they're doing or talk about what they're knowing, it's very important because you can find that out. Prior knowledge is a huge factor. We all know that. When I open up the paper, I don't read the stock reports. I don't understand it. I let my wife read that. She handles the money. Okay? My wife doesn't read the baseball scores. I read the baseball scores. And what we have is, why we can read them so well, is because we have knowledge about them. It's one of the meanings, one of the definitions of comprehension is this idea of taking new knowledge and putting it into already existing knowledge. Okay? Lastly, is she found connection with first language reading ability. In other words, she found a correlation between how well students could read in their native language and how well they could read in the foreign language. And this is how it looks, because this is I want to say compensational, but that's a compensatory model. Thank you. This is the idea that oftentimes, to the extent that students had large prior knowledge, large vocabulary, that it could make up for a lack of some of the other knowledge. So example, a person who has a very, very rich vocabulary might be able to figure out something that they don't have great topical knowledge on. And there are many other models that use that. Okay, so I was very, very struck by that. And especially the idea that many of you, I think, also feel that when you're talking about languages that are less commonly taught or have different orthographies, different writing system, word recognition is not a straightforward process. If you're using words or orthographies that do not have strong alphabetic connections, or that have alphabetic systems that are very unsystematic, like English, or you have different character sets like syllabaries, like Japanese, or what we call another 25-cent word, logographies, as in Chinese, which tends to be thought of as stressing meaning and morpheme building. All of a sudden, word recognition is not something that's necessarily straightforward. So one of the things that I like is this definition that if you're learning to read, it involves what? Becoming aware of the basic language, the spoken language, the basic units of the writing system, and how they map on. It's very interesting for those of you who are child development specialists when kids are starting to deal with language. Notice it says becoming aware of the basic units of the spoken language. This is before print. This is, if any of you have children or nephews and nieces or friends, watch what kids do, and it's really, really fascinating. The idea of the words that they say and the syllables that they say. But before they know what words are, but before they know what syllables are, they work with sounds. And this becomes extremely important because to the extent that children can figure out what these different phonemes are and how they work together to combine words and how they rhyme and how they can be broken apart, it actually is a predictor of reading ability later on. Okay? So this becomes very, very important. When we get into the basic units of the writing system, goodness me, in all of your languages that are somewhat alphabetic or that are alphabetic, you have some sort of letters where the phonemes of the language map onto. If they map on systematically, we call those shallow orthographies. Czech, Serbo-Croatian, Spanish. To the extent that they don't map on very well, we call them deep orthographies. French. Any of you ever study French? All those S's and E's, nobody says them. They're just there. Okay? So consequently, the pedagogy is le dicté. Teacher reads sentences, you have to write them down, you hand them in, and then you get them back with all sorts of red marks for all the E's and the accents and the S's that you didn't put on. Okay? How they map together then becomes very important. But we haven't talked about some of the languages that you work at. Let's say alphabets in Arabic that are not Roman. I have to learn that system. Syllabary systems like hiragana, katakana, and even Korean, which is sort of considered alphabetic, and then Chinese. One of the things that is your main task as language teachers is trying to come to terms with how your students are learning that. Well, let's look at word recognition. Is it important? You bet. It's real important. Theorists believe that in any language, word recognition, the ability to access words rapidly, oftentimes pronounce them, get the meaning, provides a necessary foundation for reading comprehension. We also know that it develops over time with plenty of experience and meaningful practice. We're going to keep coming back to that. That's an important thing for you guys to understand. That if your students are not experiencing and your students are not getting meaningful practice, they're not going to learn it. It's going to be very, very hard. It's cognitively labor intensive. I sort of like processing models. Sort of look at us as a computer where you want to have this efficient movement going on. We're going to talk about some models where it just gets to be very, very slow and laborious. And one of the reasons is that for models that view us as a limited capacity computer for learning, we have in reading a finite amount of attention. And normally what we're doing, especially when we're first starting to read in any new language that we learn, we're doing a lot of time with what is called decoding. We're trying to figure out the pronunciation, we're trying to figure out the meaning, and it's very, very slow. This is called decoding. You're not trying to figure out meaning, you're still stuck at the bottom here. So there are some theories that talk about this whole idea of automaticity, that you must make it automatic. What does that mean? It's the idea that you process something, you do something that becomes so familiar and so over-practiced that you do not pay any attention to it. Let me tell you why this is important with one theory of reading. LaBerge and Samuels came out with this in the late 70s. They made a line in the sand. They said, look, when you're reading, you're doing one of two things. You're either at the bottom with what we call lower level processing. You're still trying to figure out letters. You're still trying to figure out the pronunciation of the word. You're still trying to figure out how they go together. And you have another channel. The other channel is reading comprehension. You comprehend the text. You are able to build a message, a textual message from that text. Now, interestingly about this model was it says you cannot do both. If you're spending those attentional units on decoding the text, lower level processing, that attention cannot be put into building the message. Well, what do? Their theory says once you make that automatic, the attention is freed up to go into higher level message building. This becomes extremely important theoretically when you think about that. Well, what do? I have a story I love to tell because what's very, very important is that you can't get away from this idea of practicing and time on task. It takes time. Let me give you an example. My son was a Japanese major in college, and he started in high school. And he said, "Dad, my teacher wants you to come in. She'd like you to know if you want to come in and talk about kanji, Chinese characters." I said, "Sure, I'll be happy to do that." So we had all these little smiling faces, these kids. I want you to listen to the words of this question that I got from one person. They said, "How many minutes do I have to study?" Now notice she didn't say how long. She said, "How many minutes do I have to study each night to become fluent in Japanese?" Okay. Now, this is a 14-year-old kid. That's a reasonable question. I'd probably be thinking the same thing. So I said, "How many of you are athletes?" A lot of people raised their hand. I was living in Colorado at the time, and I said, "How many of you are state-level athletes?" Now, these are the people who go to Denver, or go to Richmond, or go to Des Moines, and they compete against the state-level athletes. These are your all-stars. One girl raised her hand. And I said, "What's your sport?" And she said, "Swimming." And I said, "How much do you practice every day?" And she said, 2.5 hours. No one in that class went. They all went. Okay. And this is interesting because oftentimes you get parents who come to you and says, "How come my kid can't translate treaties with Xi Jinping?" Well, pretty high-level skill. But when you say, "How long is your son practicing ice skating because he's going to try to be in the Olympics," which is kind of the same equivalent event, they'll just give you hours that are off the chart. My point in telling you this is all the types of skills around us that we see experts do, we are not surprised at how long they take. Some of you have probably read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Very interesting book, and it has gotten a lot of traction in the common literature, because he came out with a statement that to become an expert, you need to have 10,000 hours of apprenticeship to be top. And then he goes and he uses Bill Gates and some of the other people, great athletes and stuff. And I'm not going to hold you to 10,000 hours, but what I am going to say is that people understand that the practice and the time on task is very, very important. And to the extent that the students don't do it, or can't do it, or won't do it, will impinge upon that. And that's something that I think that we have to come to terms with and be comfortable with. It's just going to take that kind of time. The other thing that we oftentimes don't do that it says to build automaticity is you have to review those things. Oftentimes it's, here's the characters for chapter 10. Come in Friday, ready to start chapter 11? Yeah, here's the chapter 11 characters. Meanwhile, as you go on, your students are on chapter 5. Okay? One of the things that I came to terms with as a student when I was studying Chinese, I majored in Chinese in college, and I'm going to show you some artifacts from that experience. And I'll tell you what, that was quite an eye-opener. And I remember third year. To me, third year is a very important year. It's a real kind of a gateway year. And I was sitting there looking at this impossible text. And I was sitting there looking at how many pages we had to read. And I said to myself, you got to do something different here because you're not keeping up. And what I decided is that I had a language problem and I had a study management problem. In other words, I had to learn this language and all that entailed, but I also had to learn to manage it, manage the study of it, okay? And one of the things that I learned is, reviewing these things really, really helps. And so consequently, this was a strategy I found that was very important. And the last thing I want to stress is this whole idea of exposure to print. Exposure to print is this thing that you get when you go to Taiwan. You get when you go to Tokyo. It's all around you. And I think that this is a place where media and our technology can really, really help. Because the problem is, when the kids leave your building, how much exposure to print do they get? And oftentimes it's not very much. And this is, I think, an area where technology can be very, very important. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this, and what I wanted to do is maybe, because I wasn't sure of the audience, I don't want to cover this in great detail, but I did want to talk about some of the things with Chinese and Chinese characters that we think we know about, due to research that has been done with people learning Chinese. And interestingly enough, the one area that is a very, very strong topic is this idea of what we call orthographic awareness. The idea that Chinese characters are not constructed in random ways, but instead are constructed in very principled ways. In other words, I think it's around 85% of them contain an element in the character that gives a clue to the meaning, and another element that gives, somewhat unsystematically, oftentimes a clue to how it's pronounced. And researchers have been very, very interested in how this seems to work out. What are some of the things that students do? So a lot of the work has been done with interviews or different kinds of tests where students were required to, let's say, figure out the word, guess at a word they didn't know, use the radical for semantic radical or phonetic radical to try to figure out how well they can pronounce them. Let's see what we found. We found that this awareness among college students of Chinese develops pretty quickly. But the rate is highly variable. This isn't surprising. This is taken from first-year students of Chinese, many of whom have varying degrees of interest in succeeding in the language. They might have just taken it just to try it. So we always have it, and this is the problem oftentimes in working with first-year data. It's highly variable, okay? We found that it correlates with identification and production ability of learners at different proficiency levels. In other words, there seems to be a relationship between their ability to be orthographically aware and to produce characters. Interestingly enough, it probably doesn't surprise you that proficient learners, more proficient learners, do this better. They have higher orthographic awareness. But a very exciting thing is that pedagogically, you can teach people to do this. This is a huge finding. And consequently, when you look at all of these different skills, it might be that this is just not nice to know information. When I was a student, it was taught mainly as a historical exercise in the evolution of how Chinese characters got to be that way. Now, people are thinking, maybe it's going to be more important to actually teach this to students so that they can develop this, because it's a foundation of reading. With your advanced learners, when they are stuck on words, they will break the word apart. They will do that. We have evidence of that as well. We found that beginning learners sometimes infer the meaning of unfamiliar characters. In other words, if you give them a character that's not in the curriculum and ask them, what do you think this means? They will use the semantic radical to hazard a guess. Inferring pronunciation from the phonetic element is much harder. That shouldn't be surprising. Those are not as salient to the learner. They don't have as much experience with it. And also they are still developing their spoken language. Students report overwhelmingly that the knowledge of radicals is important in learning characters. This is a good find. This is a good find. What we found is traditionally that textbooks have largely ignored the systematic teaching of Chinese structure. So clearly this is something that we think should be improved upon. And as far as intermediate learner languages go, intermediate learners rather go with vocabulary. There are certain things in orthographic display. For instance, the fact that there are no spaces between word groups is still defeating for them. It impedes their progress. And lastly, among beginning learners, there is a strong relationship between knowing how to pronounce Chinese words and knowing what they mean. What I mean by that is, we did an experiment and found that in almost all cases, if you put two-character Chinese words that they already studied in their curriculum, if they knew how to pronounce them, they knew what they meant. If they didn't know how to pronounce them, they didn't know what they meant. So this becomes important because we think we've detected a learning strategy that is kind of what I call a package deal. What I expected to happen was maybe something would be written and the student would say, I don't know how to say it, but it means France. That almost never happened, which really surprised me. I was very, very surprised at the strength of the correlation. So this is again something that talks about how students seem to be learning characters. Okay. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about something that was noted in the Bernhardt model that we looked at earlier, that we sometimes don't realize when we're teaching our students to read. And this is this idea of, what do you want your students to do? And lots of times we don't tell them that. We say, go read this. Tell me what you think it means. Okay? Well, what we have found out with some models that's very important is that if you give them different tasks, they're going to do different things with them. And what I liked is this idea of this first language model that talks about if you give people different tasks to read, it's sort of like the gears in your car. That reading rates go faster to slower given how much processing we've done. Remember we talked about that already? This idea of the processing, automaticity and all that. And the more processing you give, the more it's going to take. So reading rates often go faster to slower given that there are more processes involved. And that skilled readers are very good at matching the processing with the task. Okay? Well, what are some tasks that we often use? What are some of the cognitive demands that tasks have? Some of the times, and again, I'm going to put this in gears as Carver does, he talks about the idea of, let's say, an easy gear. Scanning. You might ask the students, okay, here's a Chinese text, very, very hard. All I want you to do is to go circle all the numbers that you see. If you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, if you see any of those numbers, circle them. The interesting thing about that is that it involves lexical access. All they're basically doing is assigning, oftentimes, the form of the word, and so the processing is very easy. Now, maybe you ask them to skim the text, okay? Give me 2 ideas about the ninja that this text says, okay? Now, this gets a little bit more complicated. The rate is going to be a little bit slower. It involves lexical access and semantic encoding. In other words, they're actually looking for some aspects of meaning. So the processing is going to be slower. Carver uses a term called rotting. You don't need to write that down because everybody tells me about, I've never seen that anywhere. And I said, unless you read this article, you're not going to see it anywhere. But it's a term that he uses that he calls typical reading of a task from whereby word meanings are constructed into sentences and thoughts. It's casual, normal, everyday reading well within your ability. And this is an idea that we want to get into with having students read things that are easier to read. What does it involve? Lexical access, semantic encoding, and now putting sentences together. How's the processing? A little bit slower now. The reason why this model is so important is because Carver is interested in something that we never really talk about in foreign language reading, and that's rate. Because we know that skilled readers read at a fairly decent rate. And to the extent that this practice and time on task can lead to more automatic processing, and this, we are going to see the rates of reading increase. And lastly, he has a couple of things, learning, which is a little bit different now, because the processing is not only constructing a message, but processing it so that you remember it. And lastly, the hardest is memorization. So, if you're memorizing, if you tell your kids to memorize something, now all of a sudden you've given them a different kind of task. Because not only do they have to do all of what we've talked about, remembering ideas and rehearsing, they have to remember the facts. So there's going to be a lot of different rehearsal going on. So I think it's important that when you look at the tasks that you assign them, understand that the processing for them is going to be very, very different. And yet, depending on what the objectives of your curriculum are, it will be important for you to do that. Because one of the things that we want to get at with reading that we accept when we teach speaking, we want them to be fluent speakers of the language. Well, you know something? We also want them to be fluent readers of the language. And we think that this involves several things, some of which we've talked about. Word reading efficiency. Remember we talked about that automaticity? Automaticity means that they process things rapidly and efficiently. They have oftentimes very, very strong vocabulary. In reading, vocabulary development cannot be overemphasized. It is a very, very important process. Reading with comprehension. Fluent readers understand what they read. And they also use strategies that we're going to talking about, becoming a strategic reader. And they also read with ease. That makes sense, doesn't it? Didn't we talk about this idea that all of the automatic processing is going on so that they are able to take that cognitive energy and put it into higher message building? So the cognitive load is a lot easier. And also they read with expression. How many of you have your students read out loud? It's kind of interesting from a diagnostic point of view. You can tell a lot from that. I don't suggest that you do it all the time. I don't suggest that that's be all you do in class. But I think sometimes you can find out a lot from a student because reading with expression, they know what the mood of the text is. Again, these are some of the requirements that we have talked about that are important. The idea of automatic processing. And also, fluent readers are accurate readers. And again, because of this model is trying to get at is the idea that this adds up to a sustained reading rate that they can handle. Again, it's something that happens through the development over time. I wanted to show you what happens sometimes when there isn't a lot of fluent reading going on. Wanted to make sure that I have my notes right. I'm going to have to tell you, I have to admit this. This is one of my third-year texts. Okay? And I wanted to see what you can tell me about this student's reading ability from looking at this text. Now, if you're having trouble reading that, I'll give you a little bit of a closer view. First of all, for those of you who know Chinese, what is this text about? What is the topic of this text? There's so many marks there, maybe you can't read it. Okay? Yeah, it really gets into a lot of stuff, governmental stuff about rights of ownership and things like that. Talking about socialist systems, talking about the communist system, how that works and everything. And what I want you to do is to sort of look back on what we talked about with the Bernhardt model and think about, this is really an example. This is an actual clinic of reading failure. Okay? I mean, if you look at all the vocabulary that when he was reading, he didn't know, and how he tried to conquer that. Remember the Lebergen-Samuels model that said, if you're decoding, you're not going to be understanding the text. And so what happens is you go ahead and you decode. And that's what all of these notes are. Notice that there are English translations of some of the words, and in some cases there is actually romanization. So in other words, what I was trying to do, I don't remember this is probably when I was in therapy sometime, all of those memories were erased. And what happens is that I'm trying to access the meaning of those words. And so I'm doing a lot of decoding. And then what I would do is after I decoded it, I would go ahead and reread it. And then what I found is the next night, I would read it again. And then I was finding that this was a way that actually helped me. The other thing is, when you look at background knowledge, I was clueless. This is not something that I have much background about. So this made it even doubly more difficult for me, because I didn't have a lot of things that I could bring to it. And so consequently, if I wrote a translation of this, the teacher would look at it and say, nice job, but I didn't understand anything. So you might say, well, what did you get out of that? Well, I might have gotten some word recognition types of things and syntax, but I didn't really understand what I was writing. So consequently, what we're seeing is the text was just too hard. It's okay to say that. The text was just too hard. And what we were doing is, what we want to find pedagogically are ways that we can go ahead and improve that. And some of the things that we wanted to talk about too is, all right, Bernhardt's model, she says there's 50% of the variance accounted for. How about the other 50%? You know what? Reading theorists believe that maybe it has to do with reading strategies. The idea that maybe students don't know what to kind of look for, what to kind of do with a text. So what reading research has done is it said, okay, let's go ahead and look at native language readers. Let's look at foreign language readers. Let's look at anybody who's reading and ask ourselves, what do good language learners do? What do good readers do? Because we want to get an idea that they seem to be doing something differently. And what is it that these reading strategies might be, and why are they important? Well, one of the things that, if we want to define this from a research point of view, it's this idea that students take deliberate cognitive steps to assist them in acquiring, storing, and retrieving new information. These are things that students actually do. They are deliberate, they are goal-oriented, and they are reader-initiated and controlled. Now remember, we're talking about skilled readers here. This is often the problem that we have when we look at kind of expert system models to guide us. Because our students don't do this, they're learning. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to find out, okay, if expert systems readers, expert readers do this, are there ways we can teach them to do that? And so reading strategies, if you're into research and you want to look at different topics, there is a lot written about this in foreign language learning. Well, let's ask ourselves, what are some of these common strategies that are used? When skilled readers get a piece of paper with something written on it, whether it be a newspaper or a contract, they put a purpose down. They go in with a plan. And these plans have these definite steps that they are going to take. Oftentimes, they will scan the text to preview it, to get an idea about what the whole thing's going to be about. And when they do that, it's very important for them to make predictions. And as they go, they will check predictions. Oftentimes you'll find that because reading, like a lot of different types of skills, has a lot to do with anticipation. We sort of build what are called mental models about what is going on and what should come. And when the text does not live up to that, skilled readers will take repair strategies to try to figure out what is going on. They will pose questions, they will find answers in text. And as we've talked about a lot, to the extent that they have background knowledge, they will use that background knowledge to interpret. We know that very, very clearly from a lot of research that's done in reading. They oftentimes will summarize information, and something that may be easy for us to do in our native language that research has shown is not that easy for second language readers is that we easily connect the different parts of the text. And in this, they will pay attention to text structure. One of the things that I enjoy doing as an exercise, we used to do this a lot, we give the students about, let's say, a story that has 12 sentences. We cut it into 3 parts. Cut this, we mix it up, we give it to the student and say, put these in the right order. It's very, very interesting, the processing that has to be done for them to do that. And a lot of it has to do with very upper level type skills of building that coherent message so that they can do that. It's not an easy task. You watch your students do it. One of the things that we stress, and I'm going to go on record here to say that it's not as straightforward as we think it is guessing words that they don't know from context. The reason? A lot of times the context in the text is not that supportive. Sometimes you can make texts that are very, very rich as far as meaning if you want to have them practice this skill, but oftentimes I think this is a skill that's a little bit harder to do than people think. When we get into this idea of reading comprehension, what we know that skilled readers do is they're able to read a text and see things that aren't in the text. They infer things, making inferences. And oftentimes this becomes very, very difficult because it has to do with background knowledge and knowing what the author is doing. These are very, very high-level skills. Very, very high-level skills. Strategic readers are very, very good at rereading, something that I think is a strategy that more students did, it would be more helpful to them. And at the very highest level, once they're so strong in all of these skills, they can actually say, I don't know how the author can say that. In other words, making a critique and evaluating what the author is saying, critiquing the author, critiquing the text, and this is really where we want to go. Do you remember what we talked about early on with this idea of our standards? The idea of making our students critical thinkers. To do this in the target language is an extremely high-level skill. Extremely high level. We've talked about the processing that you have to do, so this becomes very, very important. Finally, at the end, they have to ask themselves, how well did I do? This again gets into metacognition, the idea of knowing what you know about your own knowing. And finally, reflection. Again, when you see in things like, we'll talk about this in a moment, this idea of integrated performance, a task that you might have is have the student write a piece about the text as a reflection. Now, given what we've talked about in this hour, we're talking about some very, very high-level skills. And I would not expect your students to be at this level because this is something that takes a long time. But what's exciting about this is with the standards that we have and what we know about reading, what's exciting about this is we have guideposts as to how to get there. So I think that that's very important. I want to close now and just talk a little bit about assessment. I want to leave time for some questions. But if you've been listening to me about the idea of standards-based instruction, about trying to achieve and trying to have our students become strategic readers so that they can do a lot of this higher level processing, it may have occurred to you that your assessment of this is going to look very, very different. Your assessment is going to be, if I can use the word, non-traditional. We've talked a little bit about this idea of assessment being transparent. Basically, you're telling the student what you want them to do. There used to be an old show on TV when I was a young boy called I've Got a Secret. And we always talk about that is, remember when you were taking classes and stuff and you came out of the exam and your friend said to you, how did you do on the test? He says, I don't know. Half of the material I didn't see before. Half of the tests, I didn't know what they were talking, all of that kind of stuff. If you're looking at standards-based instruction, the assessment is transparent. Remember I said we're going to tell you what you're going to do with this reading test? That's what your test is on. Okay? It's going to be authentic. Students are going to be doing a lot of tasks that are going to be things that they do in everyday life. So for instance, if they're reading a political article and their task is to come up with some inferences about what the author means, the curriculum, the objectives are going to talk about this, that this is what we want you to do. We're going to give you training and education in the curriculum about how to do this. In other words, what knowledge and skills do you need? And then when it comes time for the assessment, we're going to do certain things that are going to help you to do that you're going to be used to doing because you're probably going to be doing a lot of that in the class. But I'll tell you one thing, the authentic thing, you're going to see in spoken language and in reading that the authenticity is this whole notion of doing things that are everyday purpose. In other words, I remember when I was studying French, we could conjugate every type of verb 20 different ways against the middle. But we couldn't communicate very well with each other. Okay? But you're going to see authentic types of tasks with the assessment. You're going to be doing role plays with students. You are going to be seeing students doing debates. You are going to see them writing research papers in the target language. You are going to see them writing blogs in the target language. Everything becomes very, very different. Our job that's going to be important for us is to come up with rubrics and ways to make sure that our assessment, and this is where this whole notion of rubrics becomes very, very important. Again, it's going to be performance-based. Again, do you remember we said this idea of what were we going to do with the language? When we read this text, what do you want your students to be able to do? Do you want them to be able to scan? Do you want them to be able to read in a certain amount of time? Do you want them to be able to, again, make inferences or come up with topic sentence or show details? All of this is performance-based because what we tell you we're going to do, we're going to want you to do during the assessment. In other words, the idea of validity is the idea that if you've been teaching someone to do these kinds of things in the class, then when they come in and say, well, we want you to write about the Ba construction, there's a mismatch here. There's an invalid assessment going on. So this becomes very, very important. And then the idea of standards. We have a lot of tools to help us do this. The ACTFL guidelines, for instance, provide reading guidelines that talk about the different levels, the different reading, what happens when people read at the intermediate level, what is their performance, what are things that they can do. We now have descriptors. ACTFL has come out with those, and we also have can-do statements for those of you who teach in the K-12 environment. What is it that you're able to do for students to do self-assessment? Again, these are all out there. And the important thing, again, that I wanted to make sure you understand is if you're teaching in colleges, once this catches on and students are doing this in high school and in grade schools, you're going to get a different product. The people who show up at your door are going to want to be challenged with increasing their proficiency by doing different integrated types of assessments that involve writing, reading, and speaking. And to the extent that that program is not challenging them, they will leave. One of the dirty little secrets about our profession is our attrition. It's sad but true. We lose a lot of our students. And consequently, what we want to do is to make sure that they are challenged, they find it relevant, and that they are able to improve.